Well, we can make it work.
Okay, I think 45 won't get me in too much trouble.
And I can fill in the gaps from there. I want you more than me. Questions? Hey, Booze, how you doing? If you guys have any questions, Facebook Live is up and running, and I can take them from there. And you hear how I sound, right?
I can hear you.
And I can hear you.
Excellent.
All right. Good rising, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. Waking up with Tayla Andre is not about waking up at a specific time. It's about waking up your third eye with unorthodox conversations leading to universal consciousness. And today we have possible future governor of Massachusetts, current mayor of Newton, Setti Waren, in the building. Good rising, good rising. How are you?
I am fantastic. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming on. Thoroughly enjoy you. I love your work. I am a super fan.
Thank you.
And a super voter. If I lived in Newton, you would have me.
Fantastic.
As a
good to know.
As a voter. First and foremost, I want to say thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I like to always thank those that served, and I thoroughly appreciate when you guys wear, you know, the hats or the T-shirts or a pin, just something saying, you know, I did serve this country. So, thank you.
Thank you. You know, it reminds me, too, every single day of how fortunate I was to serve abroad for a year with men and women that I've become to know as brothers and sisters. And it reminds me that there are still people there. And it reminds me of the importance of service. So, thank you for mentioning that. That means a lot to me as a veteran of the Iraq War.
Thank you. I have family members, so it means the world to me as well. Well, for those who do not know, Waking Up with Tayla is located on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TaylaAndre. And we have some questions from your possible newest constituents if everything goes well in this new election. Tom Sanford asked, what is your stance on the Second Amendment? He said that he already knows the answer, but he would like to hear it from your own words.
Sure. Look, gun safety is one of the issues of our time in our neighborhoods, in our communities. I believe so strongly that we need to have universal background checks outside of Massachusetts, not just in. We need to ban all assault weapons in our communities, our society. They have no room. And you mentioned I'm a veteran. You know, I was trained to carry an assault weapon in Iraq. They have absolutely no place in the streets and cities and towns where we live. We need to make sure that these things are in place. And again, we have to support measures like the Attorney General put forth. What she said is, you know, we can't have these loopholes that exist to allow for assault weapons to be manufactured in our state, and she tried to close it. We've got to support her, Maura Healey, when she puts forth an order or a directive to stop that. What we can't do is have the head of the NRA be in Massachusetts become the head of Fish and Wildlife in the state of Massachusetts. This is something that Governor Baker did. The NRA, unfortunately, has been attacking Maura Healey, has been pushing against things that people believe in this country. Universal background checks, ban on assault weapons. So we can't contradict here in Massachusetts, though we do have some of the strongest gun laws. We can't contradict ourselves, and we've got to strengthen the bump stock legislation as well that needs to be passed inside. So I believe that we are at a moment where we have to do more than just advocate. We have to be a national voice that goes beyond the Massachusetts borders, because these guns flow in from the south and the north of us. And we've got to be very, very scrutinizing around the decisions that are being made right here in our state by our state elected officials.
So does that also include police officers? We know that Northeastern recently was awarded or purchased assault rifles after the, I forget the young man's name, but when the marathon bombing, Northeastern went ahead and purchased assault rifles. So is this one-sided, or are you saying across the spectrum assault rifles in Massachusetts are unnecessary?
I don't know about the particular Northeast. I don't want to, because I'm not well versed on that, the acquisition of those weapons. I'd want to get back to you on the Northeastern question if I could, because I don't know enough about it. Here's what I would say: what we should be doing is not militarizing our police departments unnecessarily. We should be ensuring our police officers are equipped with what they need to keep us safe, but we should not be overcompensating in this regard and putting weapons that go way beyond keeping us safe in local police departments that don't make sense.
And I totally agree with that. What is your stance, just piggybacking off of Tom's question, you mentioned the militarization of police, which I'm totally against. Recently, Boston police, I don't know if you're familiar, acquired drones, and they stopped the pilot program for the police cameras or body cams, but then they purchased drones that could have been, the funds could have been used for the extension of the pilot, or actually not having it be a pilot, but an actual program that we have in the city. How do you feel about that?
The use of drones. Again, this is one I'm not exactly, don't know the the Boston Police Department's proposal around that. I can tell you from my perspective in Newton, having the police department we have really worked towards a community policing model. Where I think about community policing is building relationships with people on the ground in Newton to problem solve. And that's been the approach for many decades before I became mayor. I think it's one of the reasons why we've had some success in Newton. If you're doing things as a police department that would push people away and not create that connection, then those types of issues need to be examined. So this hasn't come up in Newton, but I know, and again, I know I'm not familiar with the one in Boston, but I think if we can begin to push out and model community policing, this goes to another issue that I care about, is making sure that police districts across the state have the resources they need in regard to training, de-escalation training, unconscious bias and bias training. All these things are so important. Our police department did this. We went through bias training. We have our own modules around de-escalation. I believe that the state has a responsibility to work with the Massachusetts police chiefs to provide the resources to all departments. Some departments are barely able to keep officers on the street. There are cutbacks being made because of the lack of investment. So one of the things I would concentrate on as governor is making sure that all of our police departments across the board are working towards a community policing model with the training that's associated with it. I think it's incredibly important. I had an opportunity to meet with the head of the Mass Police Chiefs a few years ago, and we had a great discussion, myself and some municipal officials, around the fact that our departments are left on their own to figure this out, and they just don't have the resources. The departments that do have resources are able to do the types of training that I've described in Newton, and others are just scraping by. So that's important beyond the borders of Boston.
So there is another question from Facebook, but I want to piggyback off of this question since we're talking about police. One of the things that we know for certain is when it comes to Boston police, there is I might be misquoted, but 74% of Boston police are Caucasian. And we have a very low percentage of police officers of color. And this is primarily because of the oh Lord, what is the name of them? It's on the state level, and it blew my mind. But they are, I know you know this.
Are you talking about the civil service?
Yes, okay.
Requirements,
So-
exam, and preference where people live?
Yeah, so not just that, but the civil service, the first requirement is 100% veteran. So as a family member of many veterans, from my dad to my grandfather, cousins, godmother, as a veteran, and looking at possibility of governorship, would you sit down, or are you willing to have that conversation to maybe compromise instead of 100% civil service, looking at veterans first, veterans preference, maybe like a 75% veterans preference, and then maybe like a point system? Or are you willing to look over the current system that we have now that is unfortunately creating a bias, maybe not intentionally, but unintentionally creating a bias on how many diverse or others are let into not just the civil service as far as police officers are concerned, but also firefighters. And from what I understand, this is dealt with on the state level and not individual cities.
Well, it's a little bit of both. But look, the answer to your question is yes. I mean, I think what we need to do, and I've talked to our department as well, how do we look at getting more people of color in our department? What are the ways in which we do that? How do we examine past practices? Of course, we want to protect veterans being able to get into the force, but at the same time, we also want to make sure we are recruiting and getting into the force people of color, women. So this is something I would certainly look at doing with local police departments as well as the state police, both.
Thank you for that.
Yes.
This is a question from...
That's a good thing, by the way, just on the community policing end. If you have people that represent, that look like the people within that community, that's a good thing. That come from that background or those neighborhoods, that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about community policing model, this is an important component of it, and it makes us more safe in our community. So,
and one of the things that a lot of people feel is if you change the dynamic now, then you're not for veterans. So do you want to speak on that? Because if it's just like, oh, he's willing to change.
I think we can look at doing both. I mean, I really do. I don't know that there has to be one or the other. I don't think we need to pit veterans against people of color. Let's see how we could put a system together that promotes both ideas. I'm willing to take a fresh look and do that.
That's a beautiful answer.
Sure.
That's a beautiful answer. This question comes from Wampaniquin Wampatuck. He said that he is of the Wampaniquin, I am so sorry. He's from the tribe that resides in Newton, which is Nantuam, and he'd like to know, if any, do you have plans to help further the advancement and protections for tribal communities, whether or not they are federal or state recognized economically, socially, or politically? And what plans do you have to support integrate the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, specifically Article 3 of the Declaration, the right to self-determination for tribes within state language and legislation?
Love to sit down. I'm sorry, what's the person's name?
Wampaniquin Wampatuck.
Wampaniquin. I would love to connect and speak with Wampaniquin if I could. That's a very specific,
question, yes.
complex question that I'd want to learn more about, and perhaps we can take a note here, and we can get together and talk about that. I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. Another question comes from Ed Shoemaker. Communities of color come out overwhelmingly in support of Democrats. 8 or 9 of every 10 votes in the black community happen to be Democrats. How can we give us a better return on our investment? What policies will you push for as governor to better serve communities of color in Massachusetts?
I love that question. Let me just say something. Look, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I love the party for a variety of reasons. The first thing I want to tell you is I'm okay, and I believe we can challenge our own party. I can challenge my own party to do better and be stronger and be more concise about what it's going to take to deal with an issue that I believe is the defining issue of our time, which is economic inequality. We need to. So let me address the question directly. When I announced for governor back in May, I put forth a number of proposals. I want to hit on a few of them because they're universal and they also pertain to people of color as well. First, we've got to get single-payer health care in place here in the state
And what
of
does
Massachusetts.
what is that? Since I don't
Yep.
want to digress, but
Sure.
for those who don't know, what is single-payer health care?
Yeah. So it's defined, a lot of people define it different ways. There are people that use various definitions. Let me tell you how I define it. There's some great things about healthcare here in the state of Massachusetts. Around 98% of people have some sort of health insurance. That's good. We have some really great community-based hospitals, providers, doctors. That's great. We want to keep that. But at the same time, we are the second most expensive state for people here in the Commonwealth, in the entire country, for people to obtain health care. We have got to make sure it's accessible and affordable. So I put forth 4 principles and 2 areas where we can find savings. First, our healthcare system needs to be based on the health outcomes for people, and it needs to be coordinated. It has to be driven by that. Second, it should be accessible no matter where you live. You should be able to access good quality healthcare. Third, it needs to be affordable. And fourth, you need to have the right kind of insurance. Because just because you have some insurance doesn't mean you have the right kind of insurance and coverage that will keep you healthy. If we put these 4 principles in place, we can reduce costs through administrative costs and drug costs. This is when I talk to people who have advised President Obama and others around healthcare, around the system. This is the area where we can find savings, and here are the principles I believe we need to put forth. So that's what I mean. You have people in our state right now that are making choices between paying for a copay and go to the doctor or paying for the mortgage or rent. We have people in our state right now that are making choices between paying for prescription drugs they need for themselves or their family or putting food on the table, and that's wrong. So healthcare is a big driver of economic inequality. A couple other pieces I want to mention. I believe in lifelong state and community college, lifelong free community college and state college, with apprenticeships and internships included. We know just having a high school degree alone does not give you the capacity to make ends meet in this economy. We got to improve K through 12 system, provide the correct funding to address the needs of children in the classroom. The formula is outdated from the state. We've got to add to public education, and I'm talking about redefining public education. We need to add after-school enrichment, summer enrichment to public education, and early childhood. Third, housing and transportation. We have spiraling housing costs here in the greater Boston area, unaffordable. And in different parts of the state, the market for luxury housing is on fire, but everything else is not being addressed the way it should, and we really need to not just have each city and town try to do it on their own. There needs to be leadership by the state in providing subsidies to build and some zoning changes to make it easier to build certain types of housing, mixed use, accessory apartments, mixed use, two-family, multifamily homes. Third, we have in transportation. Transportation is a driver of economic inequality. I believe there's a right to move here in the state. It needs to be connected with upgrading the T, commuter rail service. The federal government just came out and said we have the worst commuter rail system in the entire country because of the failures, mechanical failures, and breakdowns. I believe in outcomes for people. You know, I took a ride on the T. A young man asked me to take a ride on the T, red light from Wollaston to Park Street.
You were late for something, weren't you?
Yes. So not that day. However, he asked me, I was tweeting about the fact that the red light had broken down repeatedly about a month ago, and this young man, Ben Chan from Suffolk University, said, take a ride with me. if you care about transportation so much. So I did. So I got on the train. And he said, look, I've almost missed classes. I've almost missed final exams. I've been late several times. I asked another guy in the T that was taking the T, IT specialist. He said, I'm in danger of losing my job because the T's late so often, 3 or 4 times a week. I can't afford to drive a car.
My son
into Park
gets
Street.
detention at least twice a week because he has to take the red line to school.
So we need to, the answers that I keep hearing from the governor is privatization. Well, we have a privatized service on the commuter rail. Look where it's brought us. Worst commuter rail service in the country. And no new revenue. We need to invest in expanding our transportation systems, and we need to invest in good, affordable housing, real affordable housing, all different types of housing to ensure people can live
So
here.
let's talk about that, especially in the
And
city
then
of
can I add
Boston.
two other
Absolutely.
quick
I'm
things, 'cause
sorry.
I wanted to answer the gentleman's question who asked. 2 other quick things in the black community I think he was asking me about. We have got to focus on entrepreneurship and growing existing businesses, people of color, micro credit, micro loans, grants, and also toolkits to give people the capacity to grow and access to channels and markets so they can grow their business. This is so important in communities in color. There has not been a sustained, specific effort to do that, and I believe that that's incredibly important. And lastly, criminal justice reform, which is incredibly important. We've got to make sure we're diverting people out of our criminal justice system that are nonviolent drug offenders. We've got to make sure that we look at the bail system that's somewhat unequal. If people are incarcerated, I just had a meeting recently with some young people, and we had a person that was incarcerated call into this meeting. We need to make sure we're preparing people for reentry, not just around treatment services, but really connecting them to their families, which is an important thing before they come out. Then when they do reenter, making sure there's a structure in place so they can be connected to the basics as they reenter communities so that we don't see recidivism happen. So all those things are incredibly important as it pertains to the disproportionate people of color that enter the criminal justice system, which needs to stop. And also getting our children ready so that they can make and earn a living in our system through our education system, and then making sure we're building the infrastructure through housing and transportation, support of small business is really important as well.
I cannot wait for you to connect with Sheriff Tompkins if you have not already.
He's a great friend.
Isn't he?
And he's one of the folks I talk to often and listen to about criminal justice reform. He has informed me a lot of my thinking around this subject. He's terrific. Love him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think you beautifully segued into Ed Shoemaker's second question,
Okay.
which was about...
Got ahead of myself.
No. Perfect. He asked, what did the recent criminal justice reform get right, and where did they fall short? As governor, what would be your top 3 areas to focus on addressing unfinished business with regards to criminal justice reform?
So I jumped ahead.
Yeah,
I'm repeating myself.
It was beautiful, though.
Yeah, around that, I think I hit the areas that
You did.
Ed was concerned about.
You did. Is there anything else you want to add to, as far as like criminal justice? What are we failing? Because I do think, shout out to Senator Sonia Chang Diaz. She worked
Yes,
very
I
hard
agree.
on that bill. Is there anything that you want to add
Well,
to?
yeah, I do want to add one other thing. This opioid addiction crisis, which is growing, we had Governor Patrick in 2014 declared a state of emergency here in the state of Massachusetts around opioid addiction. Since that time, 6,000 people have died of opioid addiction. There are over 5 people a day that die of opioid addiction here in the state of Massachusetts, 50 non-fatal overdoses in the state of Massachusetts. 250,000 people in the state of Massachusetts are living with opioid addiction. The cost of this, in addition to the human costs that I mentioned, is $10 billion a year annually. We have got to, on the criminal justice side, move these mandatory minimums aside. We cannot have them in place. We know that not for nonviolent drug offenders, we should not have these in place. We know, a couple of decades of research, evidence-based, it does nothing to reduce crime, it does nothing to treat addiction. We've got to remove those, and I will tell you, this governor, Charlie Baker, back in August, submitted a bill that would put mandatory minimums in place for nonviolent drug offenders. This is exactly what we should not be doing in regard to criminal justice.
And
It
we
is
have
wrong.
history repeating itself in a sense.
It's repeating itself. The governor's playing politics with this issue. You want to talk about incarceration rates, getting people need treatment. In addition to that, what we've got to do is put in place lifelong wraparound services for people living with addiction. I appreciate the efforts of the folks on Beacon Hill to distribute Narcan, to ratchet back some of the issues around prescribing, but we can't only focus on keeping people alive. We've got to treat people that are living.
And you recently tweeted that 1 in every 5 people that are saved by Narcan die within a year after.
Yes. This is my point, that we've got to deal with investing in that wraparound lifelong treatment that's community-based. We've got to take the stigma away from it, and it's got to happen now. I was very concerned recently when Governor Baker, in a press release, cited the fact that there's a 10% decrease in opioid deaths in the first 9 months of the year. Well, that translates into the difference between 5.77 people dying every single day and 5.33 people dying every day. It is cruel to cite this as a success. And he also announced that he was going to move $30 million from a federal waiver that's already in the system to address this issue. $30 million to address this issue, to attack and combat a $10 billion crisis. We have got to be honest. The status quo is not enough. These proposals are not enough. We've got to make. I just kicked off a series of town halls. I'll be doing one, in this area quite soon. I'd ask people to stay in touch with me and sign up to the one near you. I want to shine a light on this. I want to have conversation. I've had 2 already. I was down in the Cape. I was down in Amherst, hearing from clinicians, people that are dealing with this in every walk of life, everywhere. I want to get the best ideas out there. We can't leave any good ideas on the table, and we've got to make sure that we are taking away the stigma of this issue so people can get treatment and make that investment.
You've been a successful mayor over the past 2 terms. Why governor?
I was so lucky to have grown up in the city of Newton. My parents grew up in 2 tough neighborhoods in New York. My dad grew up in Harlem. My mom grew up in the Bronx. My dad grew up in a neighborhood that was deemed the worst block in America by CBS at the time, news at the time, because of the drugs, gangs, and violence. He joined the military to get out of that life, went to Korea, came home, met my mom. They went down south to college, threw themselves in the civil rights movement, sat at lunch counters and movie theaters across the South to desegregate. And my dad found Newton, Mass. Because he was looking for higher ed. And he purchased the home where I grew up with my 2 sisters and where I live today with my wife and 9-year-old and 6-year-old with GI Bill benefits. I believe so strongly that the issue of economic inequality is the issue of our time. This question of whether someone can make ends meet in this economy and ensure their kids can do better than they did is not happening in Boston. It's not happening in the Commonwealth. I got into this race because we've got to deal with it. We've got to be honest with it and make the investments that I talked about. And one of the things that I also said when I announced that I support something called the Fair Share Tax Amendment. This is asking people making $1 million a year or more, $20,000 a week, to pay a little bit more in taxes so we can reinvest that in education and transportation. 2 generational areas, investments to level the playing field so that people can make ends meet, just like the GI Bill did for my family and thousands of other families. This is a moment in time where we need to stand up and not accept the status quo and not allow people and communities to continue to fall behind in our state. So that's why I got into this race, and I've been hearing from people all over the Commonwealth, and I feel that if I'm able to represent you, work for you next year, this is the top of my agenda.
Let's talk about tax cuts and tax breaks and corporations coming to the state.
Yep.
what is your stance on that, and what would you do as governor?
Well, look, this idea that somehow you can offer all these incentives and breaks and things like this and give away revenue, and somehow that's going to magically create a lot of jobs and level the playing field is just backwards. One of the recent stories that were in the paper you probably saw is the Amazon search, second headquarters. And, the Governor Baker's proposal, if you want to call it one, was God bless them, go for it. Let everyone out there across the Commonwealth, all these cities and towns offer their own tax incentive packages, and, let's see what happens. I don't think that's economic policy. I don't think that that's the way a governor should look at addressing the issue of our time, which is economic inequality. So I put forth a proposal which would build on our strengths here in the state of Massachusetts and address the challenges. What are our strengths? The Amazon's moving here, or they want to move here, not because they're trying to get a tax break, but because there's intellect here, there's hardworking people here, there's great amenities here, there's a rich culture here in the state of Massachusetts. That's why Amazon's looking at this. Strengths of ours. Challenges are transportation, spiraling housing costs in the greater Boston area. So my proposal is to have Amazon come to Worcester and ask them to help us build high-speed rail, east-western Massachusetts. This would build on our strengths, create higher-paying jobs in another part of our state that would still be available to people in this part of the state if you build high-speed rail, and in different parts of the state if you build a first-rate transportation system. And you're not giving away all these tax incentives and doing it the way that it's traditionally have been done, or saying, God bless them, go for it, which is what Charlie Baker did. This is the kind of strategic thinking and leadership we need in the governor's office right now.
You talk about keeping your promises. What are some promises that current Governor Baker has not kept and that you as governor will keep?
Look, I think from my perspective, the promise that I believe we need to keep is to this generation of people in Massachusetts. What are we doing right now to ensure this generation of the residents of our state are able to have that platform of opportunity, just like I described my family, no matter where you live, no matter where you come from, whether you're from Boston, whether you're from Central Mass, Western Mass, South Shore, North Shore, no matter where you live, that's the promise we must keep. We are not going to meet that promise if we have a governor that says things like no new revenue, that continues to make cuts in the very areas we need investment. Just this past year, within the last 3 months, Standard & Poor's downgraded the bond rating of the state of Massachusetts for the first time in 30 years. And they cited the games and gimmicks being played by this governor. There are real games and gimmicks being played by Charlie Baker right now.
Break that down for us.
Just this past year, of course. Just this past year, to close a $500 million deficit, Charlie Baker, midway through the year, cut opioid addiction treatment funding. He cut transportation funding. He cut affordable housing subsidies and education funding halfway through the year. In the coming years, it closed an $800 million deficit. Charlie Baker proposed moving 140,000 people off of Mass Health, our Medicaid system, so it would be more expensive for them to afford health care. This is wrong. It's absolutely wrong. How do we keep our promises? We put single payer in place so people can afford health care. How do we keep our promises? We make sure we have a free higher ed system with apprenticeships and internships, and we update and redefine public education the way I described it, K through 12, early childhood. We make sure we're growing small businesses, medium-sized businesses in communities of color. We're providing them with the toolkit and otherwise as we grow it. We have a real transportation system to get people where they need to go. We have housing where people can put a roof over their head. We make these investments so we meet that obligation and that promise, not by making the cuts Charlie Baker is doing, not by promoting mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenders, but to really be honest and truthful about how we provide the opportunity. That's why I'm running, and that's what I would do as governor.
So, a few more questions. As far as education is concerned, so I am a parent. I live in Roxbury. My children are in Boston Public, even though they are at Edward Brook Charter. So when we talk about education, it's always in comparison to Newton. Like Newton and Needham have this, but we don't have. And you guys have one of the best education systems ever, like ever. And my